Today, I'm just going to with my last lecture. It was supposed to be one lecture, but our time is split in two. So without further ado, we're going to keep going with Sir John Locke. Last time, you got to know him and we talked about his views on human mind. We talked about his ideas of how humans were, right? Living peacefully, following their rational self-interest in a community. And we talked about this idea that the most important thing in politics is to guarantee natural rights of individuals, more precisely life, liberty, and property. And from that grew a social contract in which basically we accept the state as long as the state provides us with these rights, and the state is organized in a way splitting between the two powers and having a parliament, but that parliament was manned by the elite. So that is a social contract. Today, let's talk a bit more about the political implications of this, right? And talk about how we can think about Locke. So one difference between Locke and Hobbes was that Locke was actually involved in politics. Locke was less of a theoretical thinker and more of a practical one because he was related to it. So Locke was not a politician, but he was an assistant to a politician. I think he was an advisor of some people in the House of Lords. He was with the Whigs, which are the conservatives, within that house. So he was close to politicians. He was basically their friend. And he also took part in some big political acts, including the Glorious Revolution, which is a stupid name. It basically was a coup against the king. It was not a revolution. The people didn't know this happened. But it was a coup of the elite against a certain king that wanted to be Catholic. So a British church is a Protestant church, and the royal family has to be of that church. You learned that in the presentation on the British monarchy. And the latest king, he decided he wanted to convert to Catholicism and bring the Roman church back in, but they didn't want to have it, so they got rid of him. And Locke was involved, I think, in transporting the family of the new king to the palace, like getting them, because they came from the Netherlands, importing them, basically, smuggling royals into this, and then just helping the revolution. He also wrote the Constitution of Carolina in the United States. He was invited to do that. And that's important because a lot of his theory sounds quite American, because he talks about the world as if it's a frontier, like as if we're gonna establish a whole new country. And he was in some way involved in doing that, right? He's involved in establishing certain American states. And although that Carolina doesn't exist anymore, right? It's split now and it's part of a bigger union. His idea of individual rights and this kind of emphasis on property, etc., and freedom, you can still see that in the American philosophy, political philosophy. But because he took part in this revolution, this coup, he now had to also explain why in his philosophy, right? Because in his philosophy, if you remember, you have the king. The king is part of his social contract. But since he removed the king, now he kind of has to explain why, right? So he came with the theory that the people have an inherent right to resist tyrants. Because he said that whoever is the king, whoever is the power, has no inherent right to that power. The fact that they are on the throne in itself is not an argument, right? Or that they are the strongest, or that they have the force to be the leader, that explains why they're the leader, but that does not form any legitimate claim on it, that the people cannot resist. In order to be a legitimate leader, you need to have some moral basis for that. So you need to basically justify why you are in power. And in his philosophical system, of course, the moral basis is found in these natural rights, this natural law that gives rights to individuals. So in his logic, as long as the leader is able to guarantee the natural rights of individuals. There is a reason for them being the leader, right? As the king does that, then they are the king. But in case they don't, in case they make massive violations of these rights, like, for example, genocide, which is a big violation of the right to life, then society has the right to resist it. So as long as the king is guaranteeing your rights, which is not that complex because there's only 3 rights, basically he needs to have a police force and that's it. But if they don't do that, then you have a right to resist him. Now, I don't really see how this argument justifies his own revolution because he removed the king for religious reasons. I guess in his logic, the king switching the state religion was an offense against freedom, and therefore they had the right to remove him. But it's a bit of a stretch, I would say. In any case, he came with this argument, and that's good for the world because, unlike Thomas Hobbes, we now get some arguments of why we can have revolutions, and we will have revolutions in the very near future in that time. Also on the topic of religion, one of the things he contributed to practical politics on earth is that he was one of the first defenders of religious tolerance and a separation of church and state. This is not the same as religious freedom, because, for example, like you had tolerance of different religions. Doesn't mean you can believe whatever you want. For example, you could not be atheist, but of the different religions, he thought that the government should not, the government can prioritize one, the state of England, but they cannot suppress any religion, right? So in practice, he argued for more separation of state and church. Again, not because he was secular or because he didn't believe in God. Locke was very religious. He belonged to a religious minority himself. He was some kind of ultra-conservative, ultra-orthodox version of Calvinism, some kind of more fierce Protestantism. So he belonged to a kind of a sect himself, which made religious tolerance an interesting concept because he was not the majority, although it was related to the majority religion. But so he didn't think we should have religious freedom because all religions are equal. He certainly believed his religion was superior to all others. But he, in a common sense way, understood that it's just not worth the drama. It's not worth civil war, right? It's simply for business, it's better if we don't fight about this. So for practical reasons, he wanted religious tolerance. So not because he was scared that the church would dominate the state or the state would dominate the church. He just wanted the state and the church to be indifferent towards each other. So people could roughly do what they wanted without it leading to conflict. And that did improve things because, well, we had religious wars before that. So that is John Locke's involvement in real life politics. Let's see, Susanna has a question. I don't know what this concept of revolution is. You mean Black Lives Matter in the sense that if the government does not resist the rights of individuals, that they can resist it? I don't know if remember he had slaves, right? So I don't know if he considers black people as citizens to start with, but yeah, in a sense, the logic, if you have police suppression, right, and it is widespread, because he talks about society, which is the majority of people, Black Lives Matter, that's not the majority, but in case it would be a majority, yeah, that would give a right to resist. But you could use Locke as an inspiration, right, and use the same argument that if a government violates the rights of individuals, they're not legitimate. In a make a case for Black Lives Matter inspired on that. I think he, though, would not exactly take their side. But let's discuss that. Let's talk a bit about that topic of how progressive Locke really is. I think if you look at writing about him, there are two types of views on him. One as a hero, the other as more of a deceiver. So a lot of people, a lot of political scientists, especially Americans, like to portray Locke as the grandfather of liberal democracy, as the kind of the innovator which led to the American system, right? Where he would be this grandfather of democracy, of freedom, all these things. The other way of seeing him is as a guy who just made a compelling argument that favored the capitalist class, and who used quite some rhetorical tricks to do that. I myself tend more towards the second interpretation of it, because I have some issues with the democratic idea here. You can easily see why he inspired democracy, because he has this idea of resistance, he has this idea of limited power of the government, and his general outlook on people is quite egalitarian, right? He sees all people as capable men and women, as capable of having reason. He thinks that our thoughts are based on experience, which means that since we all have experience, we all have thoughts, right? There's no such thing as people being naturally wise or something like that. You just need to go through life to learn. And since everybody goes through life, everybody has something to say. So you could make the, I think, actually quite strong argument for democracy based on this philosophy, saying that, okay, people are not an expert in everything, but every adult has experience. And every adult knows at least their life, and thus they should be able to say something about choices that involve their life, right? Because they know it. You, as a leader, cannot have the experience of everyone. So you could make a democratic argument based on Locke, except that he didn't do that, right? People forget that. He led to all these things. Yeah, but right, he opened the door, but he didn't go through the door deliberately, not out of accident. So he was simply not a Democrat. Even if you can use his theory to justify democracy, that doesn't mean that he. We know that because the other social contract philosopher, Rousseau, is going to make that explicit case, right? It's not that in that time it was impossible to do this. Rousseau is going to do it tomorrow. And we'll see then again. Marx is the next one who picks up democracy. So I think it's a stretch to call him the grandfather of democracy because he tried to stop it. Although his theory can be used to justify democracy, but they're different things. He, I think, was more interested in this elite rule. If you look at his philosophy, right, and what he's actually doing, it's very smart how he lays up his story. Because he starts with this idea that individual interest and that of the community are compatible, right? He innovates against Hobbes by saying this. But they're only compatible insofar that this community is going to enforce these natural laws, right? Which are basically about property and freedom. These natural laws, which are natural, thus invisible, thus you cannot object to them, right? So people can be selfish. Society, the community on the other hand, has to give the people this freedom to do that. Anything else, because it's natural law, you cannot change that. You cannot also do more than that or less. So now you end up with a system in which the community is forced to do these three rights, which all favor the capitalist class. Because you have to understand, in that day, if you are a person who has to work 14 hours a day, all day, that's not even enough, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, right, to feed your family, then the right to property or freedom are irrelevant. Because you're not free anyway and you have no property, right? You just rent your house from the person you work from and you just grind till you die. So these rights are not very useful to you compared to, for example, a right of healthcare or a right to work, which you could have had. But that's not allowed because this is natural law. And the community can also not go beyond that. So what he's really doing is that he opens a political space that didn't exist before. right, that the king denied. But then again, he says, okay, we must have room for individuals, but only this. So the community does not have much power here in his system. So in a way, he sets up a state that is better than the last one, but is heavily in favor of the capitalist class. And so he's kind of masking this inequality here by telling a nice story about individual rights, where Hobbes was a lot more direct about it. Hobbes was like, I'm going to create a government that's going to dominate and suppress you. You want it? Vote for me. Not, screw you, right? He was kind of open about what his plan was. With Locke, I feel like he's very slick in how he codes things. Now you might say, teacher, you're too hard on Locke. I read he's the grandfather of freedom and equality. But he's not. Let me show you Exhibit A. I already talked about it and answering Susanna's question, and I realize I shouldn't have mentioned that yet. Locke was a slaver in the literal sense. So Locke was for equality and freedom of all people, except he also justified slavery. Not just did he justify slavery, he had a slave trade company. He didn't start it, but he had massive stock in a company that traded slaves. So what's this? He justified this, right? Like everything he does, he has a philosophical argument for it. He says, everybody has the right to freedom, but you can lose it. So if you engage in a war, which means you're fighting other people, right? You kind of put your own right at risk willingly because you're trying to kill them. So it's logical that you are willing to risk your life and your freedom. So then if you lose, right, you kind of lost that gamble. And thus the enemy can now capture you and make you property because you fought an unjust war. If it was a just war, you would have won it because God would have been on your side, but you didn't. So, you took a risk and you were wrong. So now it's okay to take you, let's say, as a prisoner of war forever. Now, maybe that argument makes sense to you, right? It shouldn't, but maybe it does. But if you look at how they did it in practice, it's such a joke. What they did in practice, his company, they would go to Africa, wait for two small tribes to start fighting each other, wait till one wins, then they go to the victor, they're like, hey, you want to sell these suckers to us? It's justified. And then they're like, oh yeah, take these men, put them on your ship, okay? Then they take them to the Caribbean and sell them here. So I have real trouble of seeing Locke as a hero of equality. But he was very inspirational. And maybe we should focus on his legacy instead, right? Well, Ms. Miranda, it's better than Aristotle's argument that they're inherently slaves and they don't really have a soul. Is it better than that? So what's his influence, right? I said I kind of reject the idea of seeing him as a liberal Democrat, but we can see him as a conservative liberal. And he was very influential. My general take on him is that he is a step forward from Hobbes. He's interesting. I just think he's a little bit overrated. I don't think he's the most important of the three, but he's often portrayed as that. And I think he's overrated for a number of reasons. Or not that he's over. I'm going to try to explain why he is so famous, right? Even if I think that philosophy itself is not better than others. First reason is that he's saying the right thing at the right time. He understood that he needed to make a case that was tolerable by the king, so he wouldn't, get his head chopped off, but that would talk not so much to the king, but to the bourgeoisie. They would talk to the local elite. Both because they are the class that was on the rise. They was also the class that was going to read books, right? The working class cannot read, so there's no point writing books to them, he thought. So he wrote for an audience that was willing to hear what he had to say. So his work got circulated a lot. And he just betted on the right horse there. The other thing he did is, if you remember, his theory is very broad. He talks about a lot of different things. And whenever you talk about a lot of different things, just like, for example, the Bible does, it makes it very easy for everyone to find at least one thing they like in your philosophy, right? So if you go very broad and you say a lot of different things, then different people can read it and quote you, like, even if they dislike 70% of what you're saying, maybe they like the 30%, right? So maybe communists will like the start of his argument for property, where he talks about labor creating property. They might like his idea of community. Conservatives are going to like his idea of representation of elites. The king might like the idea that there is still a king in his program, right? Liberals will like his emphasis on freedom and rights. So there's a bit for everything in him, and it makes him likable. So what he really did is that, rather than saying anything particularly brilliant, he formulated a lot of ideas, incomplete ideas, imperfect ideas, that would later be perfected by other people. But that means that those people are always inspired by him. They have to quote him, they have to refer to him, and so his name gets circulated, right? And I think that's how he got so big in history. So if you look at some of his ideas, they're all done better by other people, but after him. So you have this idea of individual rights, yeah, which he makes, but somebody like John Stuart Mill will make a much bigger argument for freedom and for individual rights. It's more detailed and then more substantive. His idea that there's a natural harmony between self-interest and that of the community, right? That there's some kind of, even if we're all selfish, it somehow works out. That is the moral basis of Adam Smith's theory of capitalism. Smith is going to write his whole economic theory based on this idea, make it much stronger than Locke does it. We're going to skip Bentham because he's an idiot. Is the idea of political power coming from the people, which he has, right? He has this idea that ultimately, the people need to make the social contract. They must freely do it. The king is the leader, but ultimately, if society wants to reject him, they can. That would be made better by David Hume, who I think all around is a better philosopher. He would basically say what Hobbes says, but more complete. Hobbes plants the seed of democracy, but he doesn't water it, right? Rousseau is going to water it. Rousseau is going to take Hobbes' starting point of people having their own experiences and everybody having reason and, being relevant. Rousseau is going to take that and just argue directly for it. Montesquieu is going to expand the separation of powers. Locke has it in 2 powers. Montesquieu is going to come with the 3 classic powers that we have today, right? The judicial, legislative, and executive power. That's from him. And his idea of representation of elites and vested interests would later be expanded by a real conservative, Edmund Burke. So you can see it's like a road that splits into 10 different smaller roads, right? And each of them keep going until much later. And that makes him very relevant, even if and it's personal, I don't see him as particularly brilliant, but I see him as brilliant in the sense of he has a lot of ideas. He's ahead of his time, right? He, above all things, he simply betted on the right horse. He's betting on the capitalist class, and that is the class that is going to win. Do you have questions or remarks about this before I totally switch subject? Or maybe your opinion. What do you think, Miss Regina?
Well, as you said, I think that he had, well, as we said in Spanish, like labia, to say those things, and
Mhm.
I really think that he has good ideas, as you said, but he didn't say them as well as the other ones profundizaron his ideas.
Okay.
But I think that he had, well, very fundamental ideas too.
You like him more than Thomas Hobbes or not?
Mm, I mean, Hobbes was more direct, but they are like more or less the same, I think.
Well, one argues for absolute dictatorship and the other doesn't.
Yes.
Um, all right. Any questions or remarks from? No? Good. If you have nothing to add, dear students, then I'm going to totally switch subject and try to come up with some different PowerPoint. Um, I want to talk a little bit about writing. So I finally got done grading your essays and I gave you feedback. In case I didn't, then please let me know because something went wrong. By the way, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we
Because I
can.
see everyone is up. And as you notice, it also graded you based on writing style. Now, although I don't regret my grading, you might perceive it as a bit unfair because I never really explained what I consider a good writing style. So I want to talk a bit about that right now, very short. Right. Writing is really in university. You're gonna learn specific knowledge, right? For example, about logistics or about environmental law or things like that. But you're also going to learn skills, right? One skill that you have to practice a lot is presenting. Two other skills that you're going to learn, well, you can learn statistics maybe, but two of the most important skills you're going to learn that you already know but are not good enough at yet are reading and writing. You can all read and write, but you cannot necessarily write a compelling text that's going to move people. So that is a skill that takes a lot of time. It takes years to get good at this. And we need to start practicing that so you can make your ideas in the most compelling sense possible, right? It's also very important if you want to study at other universities that you get good at writing because they place a lot more emphasis on that. So when things go wrong with writing, that usually has a reason. So I want to first talk about what goes wrong in general, right? If you have a lot of mistakes in your text, that probably is because you didn't read what you were writing. Very often students just type their text. When it's done, they press the send button and they go to the next homework, right? Because you have a lot of work. But that means that you are left with all kind of mistakes, sentences that just don't make sense because there's no verb in them, for example, that you could easily catch if you would read it. So most things with writing have nothing to do with your skill at the language. It has to do with how much space you have in redacting your text. Taking myself as an example, right? I have dyslexia and dysorthographia. I have never passed a spelling test in my life. I speak 4 languages. I can't spell in either of them. Yes, I'm probably best at English. In my own native tongue, Dutch, I have never, ever passed a spelling test. Yet, you can all read my work on my blog, for example. Most of my text doesn't have mistakes in it. That's because I just go over it again and again or ask other people to read it until it's correct, right? So it's nothing to do with talent. It has mostly to do with the amount of time you spend on it. Also, it happens because my colleagues don't give. It also happens because some people use shortcuts like Google Translate, etc. So they never learn to actually understand the language, and therefore you don't develop. And therefore I get people in 9th semester who are terrible at writing because nobody ever taught them how to. I even get people who don't even speak English in 9th semester, which tells you a lot about corruption in our faculty. Also, it might be because you don't have much experience with non-fiction, right? In order to get good at writing, and especially if you talk about style now, you need to have examples of that, right? In order to get good at cooking, you need to eat. The same with writing. In order to get good at writing, you need to read. You need to read non-fiction to get a feeling of how text works. Some mistakes some of you made, you would easily understand that it's a mistake if you would compare it to any book, just in composition. You would see, okay, there's no book that's doing what I'm doing. That's one thing. And you have people that are bilingual, but they don't actually speak English. I always have 1 or 2 students who bribe their way into bilingual, and then other teachers ignore them, and then they pick up to me, and then things get awkward. What are 3 most common problems in terms of English? Most common is past tense. Take a look at those rules. It is confusing. People often make mistakes against the past tense. That's the most common grammar mistake. Past tense comes with exceptions. There's no other way to know them than to study them. The other thing that people do wrong is the his and her, which in Spanish is different, right? In Spanish, his and her refers to the object of what you're talking about, not to you, right? So it's your man, right? In English, it's not necessarily the case. So his and her work different, and this and these also work different in English. So you have to pay attention to that. And the third thing that often goes wrong is that you literally translate sayings into English that don't exist. Like sin embargo doesn't have an equivalent in English, or for this reason is a very common starter of a sentence, which is a direct translation of the Spanish version of that, which doesn't necessarily exist, or the word order is different in English. Again, I'm not the master of grammar, far from, right? I don't have to teach any lessons in this. I'm just pointing out the things I commonly see so you know what I'm looking at. However, that's English. Let's talk a bit about style, right? Style is subjective, yes. And who am I to tell you how to write, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm the person that probably has written more text than you have read, just because I'm older and I write for a living. So I do, although I'm not the best writer, people in general like what I write. So I think I do have some understanding of writing style. So I'm going to explain you what I understand as good style, right? And you might disagree with that, etc. But I'm just explaining you my grading here. One thing that you should avoid is using a lot of very short paragraphs. So very short means 1 sentence, 2-line paragraphs. You can do that. You can use those paragraphs, but it always needs to be an exception to a rule. If your whole essay is, let's say, 60 1-sentence paragraphs, that's going to read like a WhatsApp conversation. And you can look at any book that's nonfiction, you will find no book on your book rack that is written like that, unless it's poetry, right? So try to keep that in mind. The other thing that students sometimes do wrong is make their text too personal. So having a personal touch in your text is okay, right? Let's say you talk about your father or something as an introduction. That's fine. But what you should not do is to break the fourth wall and start talking directly to me. So you should not write things like, I don't really know what to write here, but don't do that. Or don't write things like, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but you don't need to tell me your thoughts about writing, right? You can talk in the you sense. You can say, I think this or that, but you don't need to, you know, invite me to see your mistakes, let's say, or use very slang words, etc. You should also obviously avoid contradicting yourself, right, in your essays. Another thing that goes wrong is that there is no structure. We didn't see this with this Christ essay because I gave you a structure to follow, but often, for example, one good thing to do in terms of structure is to group similar arguments together, right? So let's say you're talking about problems and problems and solutions. It makes sense to first have all the problems and then all the solutions, or to have one problem and then the solution to that. Those two structures make sense. What doesn't make sense is one problem, solution, problem, solution, problem, right? So you should try to group your arguments together in the best possible way. My advice on how to do this and how to write an essay is very old school, is to first write it on paper. So let me see. These are all, this is how one of my blog posts looks like before I post it. So I first write it on paper. Why? Because it allows me to argue my to place my arguments in the most logical sequence, right, before I write that out. So that's just an advice here. One mistake that none of you made, but that sometimes happens, is that people have no introduction or worse, no conclusion. So they just explain something, but they don't say anything about it. And referencing. You have to use in-text referencing. A common mistake that people make, at the bottom of their text, they will mention sources, but they won't mention in the text when they are using that source. So these sources mean nothing to me because I don't know which statements you're basing on which source, right? So you have to use a referencing system, okay? And lastly, one mistake that people make, so this is an example of short sentences. This is from history, this is from an international law essay, right? You can see that this reads like a WhatsApp conversation. You also see, if you take any book you own, that it doesn't look like this, and that's for a reason. You don't want to restart the thought process every single sentence, right? It becomes hard to follow the argument here. But even worse is this. Students, including various of you, sometimes forget that they're writing a text. Like they're thinking of something and they just type and type and type and type and type and then they're done. But they forgot to add any punctuation whatsoever. So you get sentences that are very long. My rule is that if you go over 5 sentences, 5 lines of text, you're doing it wrong. I'm not going to talk to you pointedly for that. If you go over 7 lines, I'm going to start noting it. And some of you gotten that in their feedback. I myself never write a sentence longer than 3 lines, but it's a different standard. I would say for you 5 lines. Why? Well, it becomes very evident what the problem is once you try to read what you've written. Take this. This is from a student's essay for this course, not one of you, from a much older generation. And all of this is over 1 page of text, is 1 sentence. So, Mr. Abel, are you there? Or Abel? He's not. He left the building. Who else will I use as my Chinese volunteer? Miss Miss Miranda, are you amongst us?
Yes.
Can you do me the pleasure of trying to read this sentence?
Yes.
Out
Even,
loud, right?
even Mexico, my country of providence, saw itself unable to reach revolution until international assistance took place. Same goes to the Vietnamese Revolution and municipal other revolutions. So we are pretty double standard on that regard. We won't like the idea of international assistance provided to another country via violent means until we are the ones who need it. It's been deeply manipulated by the media and by international organisms such as the UN that peace is a solution to all problems. And that's not always the case, addressing a modern issue and national one. We can talk about the so-called war against the cartels in Mexico. Please understand that for a war to happen, a declaration must take place. The cartels controlled most of Mexico's agriculture. The cartels moving themselves through territory normally. I can breathe.
Okay, you can stop. You can stop. So, two things. You cannot breathe. And second, you probably forgot what you were reading, right?
Yes.
Well, that's what happens if you have super long sentences. You, as the author, it makes sense to you because these are your thoughts. But to the reader, the points have a function. Points relax your mind. If you read a point, you're like, okay, I'm going to store this idea and I'm going to go on to the next one, right? If you don't have a point, your brain is going to try to jam this all in the same memory, which is not possible. So you should take care of your punctuation. This guy, I think I got him a 3. I think I just refused to give him a grade. I told him to write this again. Because his whole essay is 2 sentences. Is this another sentence? This is not good, right? So these are some of my very general advice on writing. And then lastly, on cheating, right? I want to quickly still come back to this so you understand how it technically works, right? You have 2 types of cheating. Things that are actually illegal, like if you steal the work of someone else and then publish it, that's a legal problem for you. That's actual fraud. Or there are things that just break either the explicit rules of the faculty or just our implicit understanding of things, right? So what counts as cheating? Directly copying text without a reference. That's not hard cheating because you did indicate where the text comes from. Didn't do it correctly. You could excessively copy text. If you would, for example, write about John Locke and you just copy me John Locke's Wikipedia article and then you reference Wikipedia at the end. That's not, that maybe technically be correct, but in all practical sense, it's some bullshit, right? So you can also, one thing students do, and they truly think I'm an idiot, they will copy my entire slide. So they'll take one of my lectures, they'll take the text out of my PowerPoint, they'll put it in a Word file and then send it back to me, as if I don't remember my own words, right? Every semester there's some person who somehow thinks that I am blind. Don't do that. One trick people will do is they'll try to take a text in Spanish and then they'll translate it to English and hope I won't notice. Maybe I don't, maybe I do. If I do, I'll be super angry. Recycle homework from other students, right? That is a bigger problem. That can get you into real trouble, right? Or you take the same homework from other students, you change a few words, hope I don't read it on the same day, but if I do, I'll see it and you fail. Just understand cheating will have you fail the assignment or the course, depending on how bad it is. But if it's things like recycling homeworks of other people or stealing them, especially without them knowing, this can get you in more trouble. This could get you in front of the ethical committee of the faculty, and that could if you do it more than once, lead to actually you getting exposed. So don't take that risk. I'm going to be Christian and merciful and not do that the first time, but the second time I will, right? So on that note of scaring you, that's just what I want to say. So now you know, you have kind of a checklist. Okay, I have to read my text again, see if it just makes sense what I'm saying in a grammatical way. I'm not very strict on it. As I said, I have dyslexia myself. I don't keep deducting. I don't deduct you points for every mistake you made. If you make mistakes in general, I deduct you a point for that, but I don't count them. So check for spelling. Check if I don't have these 15-line long sentences, right? Does the order make sense? Do I have a conclusion, etc.? Do I have a referencing? And if you do that, your grades are naturally going to go up. All right. Okay, that's it. Any questions about this before I let you go?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Then Ms. Juno had the last word, and we will close the session. I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about Rousseau, whom I like a lot. So please tune in for that. And don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. Let me download the assistance list. Okay, now you can leave. See you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
doctor.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Take care. All right. Let us end this meeting.